Time. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining this SIP call. Really exciting one as we are joined by Maddie, who's going to give us a huge update on mining stuff in general. Hey, Matt.
Hey Jenny, thanks. Yeah, I mean, you can dive right into it. There's a few topics I know we want to, or the community at large wants to cover. But I wanted to start things off by going through the quarterly Stacks mining report, which is just something I put together as a well, I put it together initially when I was resident at the Stacks Foundation. Now more just running what I have each quarter more as just a member of the community, not any official, relationship with Stacks, but using the on-chain data and other data sources to look at aspects of Stacks mining to evaluate things like profitability, decentralization, security, all those implications. And so in the interest of time, I'll skip through most of the introduction, which is generally for people who don't understand Stacks mining. If you want to learn more about how Stacks mining works in general, you can read this introduction. It's also got links to other white papers, summary threads, etc. But let's dive into the actual report. So block frequencies are always interesting to look at. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on with subnets for Stacks, which are expected to increase the finality, the settlement times of the system quite a lot. But for now, right, Stacks settles one-to-one or aims to settle one-to-one with Bitcoin blocks, and Bitcoin blocks on average settle every 10 minutes. So even at best, if you hit every single Bitcoin block, you could only maximum have a Stacks block every 10 minutes on average. But realistically, you're not going to settle into every single Bitcoin block because there's always going to be the possibility that, for example, someone mines a Bitcoin block without including any Stacks miner transactions just because the network is suggested, for example, right? And the incentives are structured there such that if that happens, the rewards accumulate. So there is a incentive to eventually include a Stacks block. So it's not like someone could censor or freeze the chain in this way, but it just is something that can happen, that occasionally Stacks blocks don't settle with Bitcoin blocks. And so on average, you continue to see, for now, Stacks blocks settling a little bit over 11 minutes. It's increased a little bit this past quarter, but probably not too much to just within normal variation. The number of unique miners, these are people who have mined at least once. Over the past year, there's 80 people who tried to mine at least one block, or 80 unique addresses, I should say. In the past quarter, there's been 34 unique addresses that have mined at least one block of Stacks. Obviously, a number that is always important to look at is the number of typical miners that are mining a block, trying to mine the average block, and then the number of miners it would take to collude or to aggregate together in order to reach more than a collective or cumulative 50% of the total mining power. To put some of this in perspective, the largest two mining pools of Bitcoin itself actually recently have mined more than 50% of blocks at times, and the 2 to 3 top pools almost always or very consistently have reached more than 50% of Bitcoin's pool's hash power. So that's talking about Bitcoin. So Bitcoin mining, 2 to 3 mining pools is what it takes to hit this 50% threshold. That figure is comparable to Stacks. There's some exceptions that we'll certainly talk about on this call after my report, and I'll mention them here. But on average, you can see that on a given day, the number of typical miners of each block has hovered right around 6, has been the median. Dips down to as low as 4 sometimes, as high as 9 some days, but the median has been 6 on a typical day. And the number of miners that need to combine in order to hit 50% of total mining power is 2 or 3. And this is like 2.6, 2.5 typical. Now, That said, I don't know if I get into it right here, but we'll talk about it in a second. So I'll just mention it right now. That said, this is looking at unique addresses, right? And it's always possible, just like it is in Bitcoin, just like it is in any chain, that a wallet address is controlled by the same entity, right? That's what's a Sybil attack is what that is referred to as, right? When one entity or one person, one organization, one government, for it could be any type of entity, controls multiple different addresses and uses those addresses as if they're pretending to be different addresses, but they're actually controlled by one party. And so in that, there is some evidence, and we'll look at that later and we'll discuss it, that some of these addresses, some of these, 6 unique addresses that typically mine, some of these 2.5 unique addresses that typically takes the hit 50%, are controlled by ultimately, at the end of the day, the same group or organization or entity. And so we'll look at that in a second. But I just want to touch on that while we're talking about unique addresses that mine. The Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a number you can apply to basically any series to look at quantifying inequality, any distribution, any population distribution. And so it ranges in value from 0, which is perfect equality. So everyone has the same income, for example, would be 0, or all Stacks miners are the same size, be 0, up to 1, which is there's wild income inequality, right? You have people earning minimum wage and people earning billions of dollars, or you have very, very tiny Stacks miners, and then you have huge Stacks miners, and you have nothing in between. And so when the Gini coefficient goes up, that's a sign that mining power is getting more concentrated. And so you can see that Gini coefficient increased a bit, has been increasing a bit over the past year or so, and has increased on average from 2.1 to 2.4, 0.21 to 0.24. So this kind of just reinforces a lot of what is already known, that Stacks mining could use some more decentralization solutions. That's why there's a lot of work going on to enable decentralized mining pools, which will make a big difference. But always good way to quantify and just keep it in one simple index, track kind of the general centralization of mining. The number of transactions per block. This is some good news, or at least healthy to see, that the number of transactions over the past year was about 60 per block on average, 61. The past quarter was about 81. That definitely got a big boost around the this was like all the .btc BNS domain surge, the flurry of activity earlier this year. But it's healthy to see that even after that has died down a bit, it's still settled in well above historical levels, and we're getting about 80 transactions per block on average in the average Stacks block. So that's great. The percent of total rewards that are earned by miners is also something that's very useful to look at. Just like Bitcoin miners, right? If you mine Stacks, you earn both a fixed block reward and a variable amount of gas fees, right? So if I'm mining Bitcoin, I earn the Coinbase Bitcoin reward that halves every 4 years, right? And I earn whatever gas fees people paid for Bitcoin transactions that I included in that block. Same exact concept in Stacks. You're earning the block reward Coinbase that declines over time, and you're earning this variable amount of gas fees depending on how many transactions and how many gas fees they paid that you included in the block you mined. So obviously gas fees are not inflationary, right? Because they're not creating new tokens. They're just users using the system paying gas fees to miners. But issuing block rewards is inflationary. And so inevitably for any blockchain system, any system at all, you either need to do one of 3 things. You either need to pay miners inflationary block rewards and gas fees forever. So you're like Monero, for example, added a tail emission, right? So block rewards go on forever. And so the pros of this is that there's always an incentive to mine, because even if there's theoretically 0 gas fees, 0 network usage, there's still the block reward that makes it an incentive to mine to secure the network. The cons is that there's some level of inflation, though in practical terms, right, the block reward can be set such that it's like a 1 or 2% inflation year over year forever. And empirically, if you look at the price of Monero, it's held up, even after the block rewards. So it's not like this is like the end of the world. Sometimes we demonize inflation in crypto too much. I feel like what's really the problem is uncontrollable inflation, not necessarily any inflation at all. But that's a side point. Moving on, you can either pay miners inflationary block rewards and gas fees, or you can pay them gas fees and no block rewards, which is essentially what Bitcoin right now plans to do, right? Because there's only 21 million Bitcoin that'll ever be mined. And so at some point, still a ways off, but at some point, there will be 0 block rewards and only gas fees. And so theoretically, there's no inflation in this scenario. There's actually deflation because people will lose coins, and there's no new coins being created. The cons of this, though, are still being debated, and a lot of it is ongoing. But you basically have variable incentives to mine that depend on the network activity, right? And if there's not enough gas fees to incentivize mining, the network security is at risk, because why would I mine if I can't make a profit? And so either people have to pay a bunch of gas fees and there's a lot of activity, or miners might not secure the network. And so the third option is pay miners inflationary block rewards and offset those by burning gas fees. So this is different from the first option because instead of paying the gas fees to the miners, you're burning the gas fees. And this is what modern day Ethereum does. And so the pros of this is that there's always an incentive to mine for miners because there's an inflationary block reward. But if you have a high enough level of activity, on net, there's actually no inflation, or there's even deflation, because the gas fees that are being burned are equal to or greater than the block rewards being issued. And so there's some pros there. The cons, complexity, then it also requires a chain that people are like constantly using and constantly paying gas fees for. And so Ethereum has that, obviously, because they have a lot of traffic. But even Bitcoin itself, excluding some recent activity with the ordinals, doesn't necessarily have a lot of activity. And so all this to say that there's a couple different approaches chains can take, but seeing an increasing amount of fees that go to compensating miners is generally healthy, because it lets you use option 3, for example. It lets you avoid the downsides of option 2. And so we can't necessarily replace the need for block rewards entirely, but it's healthy to see more miner rewards coming from fees rather than block rewards. And so you can see this having gone up slightly. I mean, it's very variable. It's a very spiky number because in periods of network congestion, the fees spike really, really high. But you can see that there's definitely a clear trend recently of this trending up. It's stayed above its long-term median. And so it's still pretty low. But right now, last quarter, about 0.64% of total miner compensation came from fees, and hopefully that continues to trend up. It's hit, as you can see, peaks of about 8%, but it'd be possible if it continues on this trend, right, to in the next quarter settle into above 1%. So something to definitely keep an eye on, keep tracking. Now, the biggest question that everyone always has, or a lot of people have, is miner profit margin. How profitable it is to be a miner. Now, this is just looking at total miner profit margin. It doesn't mean that every miner made this profit, but it means that in total, if you sum together everything that all miners spent and everything that all miners earned, what was their profit margin? And now there's still questions about, is that being fairly, quote unquote, distributed, or distributed in the best way to incentivize decentralization and security? And we'll talk about those next. But right now, we're just talking about aggregate profit margin. And so you can see that aggregate profit margin has basically hit record levels. This is due to a couple things. One is obviously the price appreciation of stacks versus Bitcoin that has played out during Q1 of this year. But the other one is possibly, or at least partially, I should say, due to some forms of MEV, maximum extractable value, that miners are using. We will talk about that in a moment. But just to close this out, So on average, over the past year, miners in total have been making about a 20% profit margin. And over the past quarter, that's been almost a 50% profit margin. So what does that mean? That means for every 100 Satoshis you spend on mining, you are making 150 Satoshis worth of or you're getting back 150 Satoshis, I should say. And so your net profit is 50 Satoshis. So net profit of 50 Satoshis divided by the 100 Satoshis you put in is this 50% profit margin. And so, yeah, it's been very profitable for miners. Let's look at some of those things I just mentioned. So two new forms of MEV that have always theoretically been possible, but have just started showing up and people noticing them, people actually using them for the first times recently. The first type of that MEV is Bitcoin miner MEV. So if you, because you mine stacks by sending a Bitcoin transaction, if you're also a Bitcoin miner and you win a Bitcoin block, right? What does it mean to win a Bitcoin block? It means that you get to include what transactions go into that block. So if I'm a Bitcoin miner and I win a Bitcoin block, I can look at everybody else who's trying to include a Bitcoin transaction to mine stacks. And I can intentionally not include those transactions in the block. And I can include only my personal transaction, my personal bid to mine stacks in that block. What that means is that I can bid almost nothing and be the only miner, and so be guaranteed to win that particular stacks block. Again, this doesn't mean that this can happen in every block. It's only blocks that pertain to the Bitcoin block I win, right? So I first need to be winning Bitcoin blocks, and then I can do this form of MEV on stacks. And so in practice, a large Bitcoin mining pool seems to have started doing this, where they will bid on blocks, because you also you can't just do this like bid nothing, bid nothing, bid nothing, win a Bitcoin block, bid something, and win the stacks block. You have to consistently be bidding something. So there are measures in place that minimize this to some degree, but further work can be done to prevent this or to minimize the impact. But basically, one of the biggest Bitcoin mining pools is doing this, and because they're a big Bitcoin mining pool, they're winning a relatively high amount of Bitcoin blocks, and because they're winning a relatively high amount of Bitcoin blocks, they can then use this form of MEV or apply this form of MEV to a relatively high number of stacks blocks that correspond and write to those, are written by those Bitcoin blocks. So that's the first form of MEV. And you can see there's discussions about how to solve that. We'll get into those today, but that is obviously improving profitability in aggregate for miners, but only going to that Bitcoin miner profit. So it's not profit that's going to other Bitcoin, other stacks miners. And so we will look at it broken down in a second, but I want to talk about the second form of MEV before we do so. So the second form of MEV, totally distinct from Bitcoin miner MEV. You don't need to be a Bitcoin miner to do this. It's this orphan block concept, and basically, orphan blocks occur in any blockchain, especially, well, at least in any longest chain consensus mechanism blockchain, right? So in Bitcoin itself, Bitcoin is the longest chain consensus mechanism, right? You're building blocks via proof of work. If you have more mining power than someone else and you're producing blocks faster, and let's say Bitcoin is currently at block 100, right? Somebody else could mine a block and add it to the chain and say, oh, look, I found block 101 and I added it to the chain. But if you're mining so fast that you have found a different solution, a different hash, or you also found a hash solution, and you can mine, what you call block 101, and then you also mine the next block, and you mine a block for 102, you can say to the network, hey, I've got block 102 now. Look at my chain. Look at my version of block 101. And effectively that chain, because it's the longest, now becomes the chain that everybody uses, right? That's the source of truth. And this first version of block 101 that someone found essentially gets orphaned, right? Because it's floating out here. It's not in the longest chain anymore. And so that is why when users who are less familiar with this concept, you still see this when you deposit to an exchange, for example, right? And the exchange says, well, you need to wait, 3 blocks, 6 blocks of confirmations before we confirm that, yep, we've got your payment, because the recent blocks can often be orphaned. And now the further back you go in the blockchain, it's harder and harder to do this, right? Because if it's now block 110 and you're trying to replace block 101, you need to mine 11 blocks faster than everyone else in order to do that. And so that's how, in general, longest chain blockchain consensus kind of works. And why this is playing out, or how this is playing out as a MEV issue in stacks, is that there are miners, plural, who are occasionally ignoring blocks that people are producing, and then instead mining their own version of the chain. And because they're mining faster than the other miners, basically replacing their chain and basically taking the profits that first miner, quote unquote, should have earned. So that basically, makes it doesn't necessarily directly reduce stacking rewards. It doesn't necessarily directly reduce network security itself. What it does do, though, is it makes it less profitable for these smaller, honest miners, and therefore they're less likely to mine. Therefore, there will be fewer of them mining, and so it leads to, it's kind of like a self spiraling feedback loop, where if a big dishonest miner or a big miner starts orphaning blocks, they can kind of make smaller miners less profitable, which means smaller miners mine less, which means the bigger miner has even more room to play around with and orphan blocks. So it's definitely something that that talks are ongoing of like how to address this type of problem, because it's not really a problem unique, or in theory, the concept is not unique to stacks, right? Like orphaning blocks and ignoring blocks and creating your own chain is not a unique concept of stacks. Any blockchain like Bitcoin, for example, but there are some unique aspects of stacks that make it maybe easier. There's possibility that there's a bug in block propagation that is making this problem happen more often. So definitely there's some ongoing conversations in the forums that you can dig into, and we'll talk about those in this call. Just to wrap up quickly so that we have time to get to everything, I did go and look at the profit margin distribution of quote unquote MEV miners versus non-MEV miners. And so I looked at some great work that was done to look at the addresses that were taking advantage of this orphan block MEV. And they also looked at the stacks address of the Bitcoin miner who's taking advantage of the Bitcoin miner MEV. And I looked at just the profit margin that those miners made. And then I looked at the profit margin that every other miner that is not one of those MEV miners made. And so you can see these numbers aren't perfect. They do make some assumptions. They do they do slightly overestimate the non-MEV miners' rewards, because they're ignoring things like the gas fee they paid in the block that was orphaned. But generally speaking, yes, we see that MEV miners are making substantially higher, right? Like 3x, 2x higher profits than non-MEV miners. But it is not true that non-MEV miners are losing out in aggregate, in total. There's certainly miners who are mining unprofitable. If you're a small miner, right, there is a break-even cost. But all miners, even non-MEV miners, are making a profit, at least right now. Although it is certainly the case that MEV miners are making more of a profit. Whether that's quote unquote fair or not is a discussion, but most of the matter is MEV miners collapsing the security of the network, right? Or like it becoming more centralized. That's really the more pressing matter. A side effect of that is that they're making more profit margin. Another way to look at this is percent of blocks with only one bidding miner, right? So if going back to this concept of Bitcoin miner MEV, if like every Bitcoin miner was taking advantage of this MEV, then every single Bitcoin block would have only one stacks miners transaction included, because they would never include anyone else trying to mine stacks. And so you'd expect 100% of stacks blocks to have only one bidding miner. In reality, you have about 7% over the past quarter, which is certainly not great, but it's, you know, it's not approaching some, again, it's not approaching anywhere near 100%. So it is reducing the stacking yield, but it is not the end of the world, I would say, right? This 7% figure should not be misinterpreted as saying like all else equal, a 10% stacking APY would be reduced 7% down to a 3% APY. It's more saying it would be reduced from a 10% APY to a 9.3% APY, because you're reducing the numerator by 7%, not the total thing by 7%. And then just wrapping up, one of the biggest, if not the single biggest hurdles remaining to why there are not more stacks miners getting started stacks mining is that it requires a pretty significant amount of capital to invest each cycle and even break even, not even profit, right? Why? Because you've got to profit enough to offset the gas costs, the fixed costs that you're paying to send Bitcoin transactions. So if you're mining as a very small miner, you're basically paying this huge fixed cost of gas fees on the Bitcoin chain, and then only profiting not enough to recoup that loss. And so the good news is that in both USD terms and Bitcoin terms, the cost to break even for new miners entering has gone down. And this is an aggregate, right? So these costs would be theoretically higher for non-MEV miners because they have lower profit margins. But in general, the trend is going down, where you need, instead of like $20,000 or almost, you know, 3/4 of a Bitcoin, you need about a third of Bitcoin or $10,000 each cycle to even get started mining and break even. So some promising pictures in, you know, growth of network transactions and usage, and also some concerns about forms of MEV. But there is also a positive side to the forms of MEV in that other communities and miners are starting to notice stacks more and think of it as, quote unquote, you know, this like worth their time to try to apply MEV to. So that's actually somewhat of a silver lining, even though obviously if unchecked, this MEV could lead to greater centralization and less security for the chain. But yeah, that's everything for me. I want to make sure that we have time to talk about these two MEV issues in particular.
Thanks, Matt. There's some discussion in the chat if you just want to take a look at it and see if there's anything you'd like to add based on what you just went over. And anyone else, if you've got questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. It makes it easier to go through them question by question. You
So
can
Marshall,
also yourself.
Yeah, so Marshall was asking, would the orphan blocks have any impact on that profitability calculation? It would only have it, I think, in terms of I'm not capturing the gas costs that people paid in those orphan blocks. But yeah, the orphan blocks could definitely, I mean, they definitely are impacting the non-MEV miners profitability. So there's not like an easy way to get that data, but I'm open to trying to, you know, getting that data so we can look at it in more detail. But so the short answer is yes, absolutely. The long answer is with the frequency it's happening, it's probably not reducing it to 0, but we need to dig in further. I want to see this orphan is hurting both the orphans and the orphaners. Yeah, so we should definitely talk about like that in the context of the Bitcoin MEV or the MEV in general. There's Andre raises a question of like, is it desirable that Bitcoin miners all mine stacks, or like every stacks block is mined by a Bitcoin miner? I think in some ways, well, you'll get different responses. My personal view is that in some ways it is, because then you have you know, Bitcoin miners also securing stacks, but it's especially with the introduction of SBTC and the way that SBTC uses the POX yield. with the inclusion of that, you would want to make sure that Bitcoin miners aren't, mining stacks without also securing SBTC via the POX yield. So that does matter. If you exclude the foundation stacks miner, the non-MEV miner overall profit would be much lower. Could be true. Yeah. I don't know why. It'd be interesting to look at why, in theory, even the foundation stacks miner doesn't get orphaned and other miners do. Is it its size? Is it like the MEV miners are playing favorites? Like what's going on there? That seems a bit odd. Do orphan blocks still receive the block reward? That's a great question. No. So how do block rewards work, technically speaking? It's actually, you are actually, as the miner, including as the first transaction in the block, this transaction from the protocol, like from Bitcoin itself to yourself, right? That's how you earn the Bitcoin block reward. It's actually like a transaction that you're including in the block you mine. And so if that block becomes orphaned, just in the same way that like a deposit to an exchange doesn't confirm and changes, and actually now the chain says you never made that transaction because there's a different block with different transactions in it, that new block has a different miner getting that Coinbase reward, that block reward transaction. And so just in the same way that a normal vanilla peer-to-peer transaction would be orphaned or overwritten or ignored, right, in an orphan block, the same thing applies to the block reward in orphan block. So the miners who orphan that block are essentially, I want to say stealing, but they're kind of like saying, you would have won this if this chain history remained legitimate history, but I'm ignoring that history and rewriting my own history, which shows that I win this. And so, yeah, that's how that works. How statistically dependent are the two MEV issues, if at all? It's a good question. I didn't look at like a breakdown of correlation of how often one miner is doing one attack versus the other. Theoretically, right, they're like totally independent vectors. Like you could be a Bitcoin miner and do the Bitcoin MEV, and or you could orphan blocks. I don't see them as technically related, but I did not explicitly look at how often the Bitcoin miner is also orphaning blocks. The two MEV entities they're separate addresses, at least for now. The address that is the address that is doing the Bitcoin MEV is not an address that is included in the list of known or suspected orphan block MEV addresses. Yeah, it'd be great to have other people jump in. I mean, would love to hear from core devs and other people and anybody on either one of these MEV issues, because it's great to spend 10 minutes or so on each of these topics.
Yeah, so I would say thank you very much for presenting this and writing this up, Maddie. This everything that you kind of covered here sort of matches what I've seen, just trying to analyze various behaviors in the network. I do wonder a little bit about the actual sort of like benefit of the orphan MEV, because like Bryce asked in the questions that if you're a miner and you orphan another miner, you don't actually you're not like claiming their rewards. Like all you're doing is maybe making them less profitable. And so you have this like sort of secondary effect on your profitability where like if you can push people to stop mining, then then your profitability goes up. It's not like immediately obvious to me that that's like the behavior that's occurring, but like these orphan rates are like high enough that it's definitely like impossible to ignore and just like say that this, you know, this is like an accident of the network or something like that. So this all makes sense. To Igor's question about some correlation between these events, I think correlation is probably too strong of a word. I think that like if you look at what's being orphaned and when, there does seem to be a higher orphan rate following either what like we would call like a Bitcoin flash block, where a Bitcoin block was mined very quickly, and maybe it doesn't include all of the miners' commitments. Maybe it only includes one commitment. There's like a correlation between flash blocks and orphaning. And there's also a correlation between Bitcoin MEV blocks and orphaning, which is interesting because from the perspective of other miners, those events can actually look quite similar, because like a flash block is a Bitcoin block that doesn't include all of the miners' submitted transactions. And then like also a Bitcoin MEV block is a Bitcoin block that doesn't include other miners' transactions. So I do think that there's maybe something interesting there, especially related to like the interaction of like how miners use RBF and RBF limits. Because like in response to a flash block, you as a miner, you have to replace your previous transaction. And to do that, you have to RBF. But there's like an RBF limit in the code. So like you can do at most like 2 RBFs, depending on your miner configuration, before you'll stop doing RBFs. And so if you use one of your RBFs to like replace your transaction from like a flash block or from a MEV block, then you don't have leftover RBFs to use when you're trying to like update what chain tip you're mining off of. So there's like maybe another sort of like driving factor there. But beyond that, like I do think that Bitcoin MEV and the orphaning behavior are probably just like separable issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly from a lens of like, how would you address them? I would think they would have totally different, like different challenges. But so on the orphan block topic, let's stick with that one for now. There's some people in the chat referring to this potentially being a mining service that is basically on a low bandwidth connection, so their blocks are arriving late, which all means that this is not happening maliciously or intentionally, at least. Are there who it'd be good to understand like who is looking at that and how to even evaluate that, whether this is, you know, intentionally happening or not, whether this is a bug or just something.
So I know that Jesse Wiley from the foundation has been looking pretty closely on this, and we've been trying to build relationships with miners to understand if it's a network issue. Of course, I'm trying to be very mindful of privacy here, but we thought that there was potentially mining operations in parts of the world that have poor connectivity, but we've actually found evidence against that. And so I haven't received much updates from Jesse, given that was another critical update to the miner software released yesterday. But everything points into the direction of there being a partition in the network. And I rather not attribute to malice something that can be generally attributed to just poor configuration or just, not enough oversight over the mining ops. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we have so far. And I don't know if we can get Jesse Wiley here in the next 15 minutes. So.
Probably not, but yeah, it sounds like it'd be good to have a follow-up community call discussion on that investigation. But to understand what you've been saying, is that if it is this partitioning that you're referring to, is that, do you suspect something that could be like addressed with a hard fork change to mining logic, or would that require more of some form of soft incentive, like a reputation system or something that would encourage miners to kind of punish or exclude or ignore bad actors or actors who are partitioning or orphaning blocks?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I think what we've been trying to go after today is actually fixing the people engineering so that we can just understand what the real problem is. And because we do find that it's a partition issue, okay, let's put a ping service, let's correlate it with the orphan rate, and then perhaps persuade them to either them to go to our partition or we go to their partition, right? And that would be like kind of the quickest fix for that, right? But this is in a assuming that the ecosystem is still small and we can everyone is trying really to have good intentions, right? What you're proposing would be more applicable when I would expect when the ecosystem grows and we can perhaps there's indication of evilness, right? Which we have not seen, I think, and I think Aaron has, we just are not, without seeing that anyone is kind of like profiting or on the orphan thing, on the Bitcoin MEV is obvious, right? But not on the orphan things, right? So we don't see that. And so I'm a bit worried of complicating the consensus rules and to add anything slashing is just that's kind of hard to pass through. But Jude has proposed this proposal that is kind of lift mining off chain. And so what that would enable, and there's a stacks form, and I think I posted the link to Andre's question if we want to see it there. I think my understanding of that is then kind of the mining coordination would happen off chain, right? And so in that case, we could be making changes to that perhaps more dynamically. And it's not clear to me, but that would kind of, maybe invalidate this problem, but it could also open up other problems, right? And so I'd love to hear what Pavi and Andre and perhaps Aaron have to say about this. Of course, I would love Jude's opinion.
Pavitra, is there anything you want to
Yeah. So updates on the solutions for Bitcoin MEV.
On the orphan thing, I think Jesse has been.
Oh, okay, yeah, Jesse's on that issue. But his updates are basically that he spent a few days this week crawling the network using, I think, the V2 neighbors endpoint. And so he was able to discover that some of the nodes were very poorly connected. Like he only found some nodes after crawling through like hundreds of nodes, is what he told me. So he basically was able to like reach out to some miners and ask them to change their peer settings, actually.
Yeah, so I think that's also what I've been getting from is that we're forcing peering explicitly, right, between each other, and that makes it more, hopefully it reduces. But if it's really, it depends on which network stack level, right? If it's kind of at the first level, right, physical layer, there's not much we can do, right? That's like somebody breaking physical, fiber cable. If it's something at the control level, TCP level, I don't know at what point it is. And so sometimes, things are, I mean, I know that the Bitcoin peer network is a lot more advanced. That has maybe IPv6 support and some or the new I guess TCP protocols. I don't know, like that have come up recently. That could be another work stream that we could explore, right? Like if it's really a peer network reliability, then maybe we should draw from the learnings that Bitcoin has for their peer network and just incorporate those changes to make our network more robust, I guess.
Yeah, so I think that there's like 2 points that are maybe important to touch on with in terms of the network connectivity's impacts on this. So one is that, like, if you're interested in collecting data, like I'm looking at the chat and there's people talking about looking at some of this data and having taken a look themselves. So a stats node just by default tracks the arrival time of blocks, which is one direction of the question. And I agree with what Peters is saying above, where blocks are getting propagated basically by all miners pretty quickly. Like there doesn't seem to be much difference in block arrival time if you look at a well-connected node. Like if you are running a well-connected node, like you're getting a lot of blocks. And that's like relatively easy to look at if you look at the staging blocks table in the chain state database. Like there's just an arrival time column. But that's actually only one direction of the question. The other direction is how fast are blocks arriving at a miner? And that's like impossible to answer if you're like not the miner, right? There's like things that you can try to do to estimate that. And like, it sounds like one of the things that Jesse Wiley has been looking at is just sort of like crawling the network and trying to like figure out how connected different nodes are. But like certainly if you're like a poorly connected node, it's easier for you to disseminate blocks than it is for you to receive information about blocks. So that could also be driving some of this behavior. But I do think that it's important to say that, like, just from an external view, like you can't really differentiate between like poor configuration and like maybe this like malicious or whatever MEV behavior. And so when thinking about like solutions to this, like I think that we should try to solve networking problems if we can, but we should also be like trying to think about just like what the solutions are to this MEV behavior. And like one of the things that I think a lot about is just like if we can encourage more heterogeneity in mining, like decentralized mining pools, all sorts of things like that, then the impact of both like poor configuration, but also the viability of this orphaning behavior, MEV behavior, is also reduced. So it's just like a general win for the network to increase miner heterogeneity. Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is that, yeah, the internet is just, it's a minefield out there, and there's just who knows how much queuing different zones have, and we just don't know what packets are doing, right? And then the second point is I'm actually concerned because I think in the limit, like heterogeneity kind of when like takes advantage of like the large number, right? Like maybe central limit large numbers, right? Where you just get an average behavior that is supposedly resilient against these things. But what about like the not so large case? Maybe when you have 10, 20 miners, could we have a case where some combination of heterogeneous configurations could actually be incompatible and going to create kind of weird interaction?
I think that with that situation where like miners are generally split, and the largest colluding party or whatever pool only has 10% of the hash power or mining power, this orphaning MEV behavior is like not profitable at all. Like I think that it just like makes it entirely non-viable.
Everyone is losing out of this. It's like there's no clear entity gaining from this, at least not known.
The only question I had on that, so yeah, I agree 100%. Everybody's losing from this orphaning. Has anybody looked to see if they're doing any kind of MEV within the stacks blocks? Like, are those blocks that they're creating sibling blocks for, like censoring any stacks transactions or something like that? Like that's the only remaining possibility that I could see of this being a malicious, purposeful attack, is if they're doing something in the blocks that they're creating. But I haven't seen any evidence of that. But that's like the only remaining scenario in my mind for how they could be profiting.
I think that's a good point. And I think if it were happening, we were hearing it from Chente and going like we would know. That would be my kind of feeling, right? If people were reordering things on the exchange.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to get positive confirmation, maybe Chente and other exchange operators, right? That things are not being ordered. Maybe that would be helpful so that we're not making assumptions. Hopefully we're doing Alex team. Okay. Maybe everybody can talk this time. Or maybe she can unmute. That's why.
I'm just gonna flag we have 4 minutes left. I'm happy for this to go over, but someone will have to take over the Zoom meeting if we have any volunteers. But we can also schedule a follow-up discussion. Like Maddie suggested, it sounds like there's a lot here that we want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, definitely a lot here on the orphaning blocks, because it seems like there's still, you know, questions about what exactly is causing it. Is it intentional? Some open, it's probably not, I mean, it's probably not directly profitable for the entities that are orphaning the blocks, but there's some, it is possible that it is. So open questions on that. And obviously if it's shown that there's a pattern in how these blocks are being orphaned in the way that MEV is being extracted and ordering the transactions in the blocks, and that's pretty conclusive evidence that this is being done intentionally to extract, you know, a profit, which is damaging the honest miners for the direct benefit of the orphan miners versus just like damaging both parties. And we haven't really touched on the Bitcoin MEV stuff, so I think it would definitely be worth another call to explicitly go through those two things. Just to briefly mention it, because I don't think anyone has yet, there is a forum post specifically on the Bitcoin MEV. The solution there, at least proposed so far, is to basically impose some kind of minimum spend. So even Bitcoin miners would still be needing to spend Bitcoin to mine stacks. So you preserve the stacks yield, the POX yield, and its benefits for SBTC. But that's super high level. It's not, we don't really have time to get into the details of that. But does anyone want to, I don't know, Hero or anybody else want to just close out the conversation right now on the orphan block MEV? What are next steps? Like, it sounds like Jesse's continuing an investigation. Are there other open threads, other open next steps? And then we can, you know, community can get into those on a future call.
I'll chime in real quick. My personal perspective, I'm less worried about Bitcoin MEV because there's a work stream with kind of, the problem is clearly defined, and I think just we're finding a solution, and we have a target hard fork sometime in Memorial Day. I mean, optimistically, right? The orphan one is just like, we don't know what's going on, so that one, I'm more anxious about that one, because you just don't know, like we don't even know what's going on, right? So, but we're spending time, like Jesse is spending a lot of time figuring out, right? Unlike, you know, perhaps earlier when this was initially reported by Peters on sometimes in September, we just, yeah, things like now it's just getting attention, actual resourcing. So I wanted to, you know, maybe comfort the community that this is getting, I see the meetings, I see the updates, and it's getting the attention, right?
Okay.
I mean, I'm sorry, I had an internet outage until just 10 minutes ago. So is it worth like chatting again next Friday, maybe? Like, it sounds like as if it's not concluded and maybe it's not yet ready to propose a solution to the public. So if it's helpful for you guys, we can host another session on the SIP call next Friday.
I think that it's probably too early to say right now, just because I think that there's still so much unknown about what's going on with the orphan rates and like ongoing research and analysis. I think that like we should plan to have a meeting if there's something sort of specific to discuss. If there's not, then right, I think that we'll probably just be like sort of circling the same topics.
Yeah, I think that the call is just meant to provide reassurance that this is talking, but I think we should just maybe as a community do better of posting async updates to the forum or GitHub and try to reduce meetings as much as possible.
Yeah, no, it's just a place to facilitate and communicate to everyone. So whenever you guys are ready to talk about something, if there is something to talk about, then SIPCO is a great place to have. Yeah, so
I find this meeting useful to know that there's real people looking at this and people care, and that's it. Right? The technical details we can fight them over in the
yeah, people definitely care, I would say, in the community. They just don't know that it's going on so severely, maybe, or they don't even know how severe it is. They just have very little idea, and at some point we'll need to let them know. Because I mean, a lot of things are some things they don't know and maybe it doesn't impact them, but like things like this impact directly to their how much Bitcoin they're getting. As soon as they spot that, then yeah, they do care from that perspective. Okay. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. And we will arrange maybe another call at some point whenever people are ready. Yeah, so just give everybody time back. Thank you everybody for coming. Yeah, see you another time.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.